2:43 in the afternoon, August 18, 1966. Rain falls in sheets over a rubber plantation 5 kilometers from an Australian base called Nui Dat. The trees stand in perfect rows, planted for harvest, not for war. And that is the problem. There is nowhere to hide, and nowhere for an enemy to hide either. Except there is an enemy, closer than anyone expected. 11 Platoon, D Company, 6th Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment, moves forward through the mud. 32 men. They are not looking for a battle. They are looking for mortar base plates, the launch points of an attack that hit their own base the night before. It should be a short, uneventful sweep. Follow the tracks, confirm the enemy has moved on, walk back before dark. Then the tree line in front of them opens fire. Not a handful of shots, not a small ambush. A wall of automatic weapons fire that drops men where they stand. Within minutes, the platoon commander, 2nd Lieutenant Gordon Sharp, is dead. Radios crackle with static and screaming. The platoon is not fighting an enemy patrol. It is fighting something far larger, and it does not yet know how large. Behind 11 Platoon, the rest of D Company, barely 100 men in total, begins to understand the same thing, one radio transmission at a time. This is not a skirmish. This is a regiment. Australian intelligence had estimated scattered Viet Cong activity in the area. Small units, local guerrillas, nothing that should trouble a company on patrol. What Delta Company has walked into is a reinforced regiment of the Viet Cong's main force, backed by regular North Vietnamese troops. A concentration of firepower that outnumbers the Australians by a margin some would later place as high as 20-1. The company commander, Major Harry Smith, is somewhere behind the lead platoons when the shooting starts, piecing together a battle he cannot see through rain that has turned the sky the color of gunmetal. He has no clear picture of how many men are out there in the trees. He has wounded soldiers he cannot reach. He has a scattered company that must somehow become a single defensive position before the numbers overwhelm it. Back at Nui Dat, artillery officers are already doing math. If this position cannot be reinforced, and if the guns cannot reach it accurately, 108 Australians could be wiped out in a rubber plantation most of them had never heard of a week earlier. The real question of Long Tan was never simply whether the Australians could fight. It was whether a small, isolated force, cut off, outnumbered, and blind in the rain, could survive on firepower alone, called down from miles away, adjusted minute by men who could not see what they were shooting at. Only trust the coordinates radioed back to them. By nightfall, one side would control the field. The other would count its dead in the mud between the rubber trees. What happened in the 4 hours between the first shots and the final relief would become the bloodiest single engagement Australia fought in Vietnam, and a case study in what artillery, discipline, and a command decision made under absolute pressure can accomplish when the numbers say it should not be possible. To understand how 108 men ended up facing a regiment, you have to understand why Australia was in Phuoc Tuy province at all, and what its commanders believed they knew about the enemy in front of them. Australia's combat commitment to Vietnam had grown through 1965 and into 1966, moving from advisors to a full infantry task force, operating under its own area of responsibility. In the first half of 1966, the men of 6th Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment, arrived in South Vietnam and were assigned, along with supporting artillery and armor, to a province southeast of Saigon called Phuoc. The newly formed 1st Australian Task Force set up its base at a place called Nui Dat and began the work every new force in unfamiliar territory has to do: mapping the ground, mapping the enemy, and figuring out which parts of the province were actually contested. On the surface, the picture looked manageable. Local Viet Cong units were known to operate in the area. Larger, better organized main force units were assumed to be elsewhere, moving through the province rather than concentrated in it. That assumption mattered because it shaped how routine an operation looked on paper before it happened. In the early hours of August 17th, that assumption was tested. Nui Dat came under a sustained mortar and rocket barrage, dozens of rounds landing across the base in a matter of minutes, damaging tents and vehicles and wounding Australian soldiers inside their own perimeter. It was a message. The enemy could reach the task force's home ground, strike it, and disappear before daylight. The Australian response followed standard procedure. Patrols were sent out to locate the firing positions, trace the withdrawal routes, and determine what kind of force had carried out the attack. B Company spent that day working through the bush without significant contact. The following morning, the 3 platoons of D Company were sent out to relieve B Company and continue the search. This is the old system, working exactly as designed and exactly as it would fail. The doctrine was sound. When your base is hit, you find out who hit it and how big they are. But the intelligence picture feeding that doctrine had a blind spot. It treated the mortar attack as an isolated raid rather than as the leading edge of something far larger already moving into position nearby. Nobody at Task Force headquarters believed a full regiment, reinforced in some accounts by regular North Vietnamese troops, was operating within a few kilometers of Nui Dat's own perimeter. Major Harry Smith led D Company out from the base that afternoon with orders that read like routine follow-up, not a warning. 105 of his own soldiers, plus 3 New Zealand gunners, attached as part of the artillery observation team, walked toward a rubber plantation with the expectation of an empty search area, maybe a brief contact with a small rear guard. What the old system got wrong was not the decision to patrol. It was the size of the threat that patrol was walking toward. And in a war fought in triple canopy jungle and rubber plantations where visibility could collapse to 20 meters in heavy rain, that kind of miscalculation was not a paperwork error. It was the difference between a routine afternoon and the costliest 4 hours in Australia's Vietnam War. Major Harry Smith was 31 years old and had built his career on discipline. The kind of officer who trained his company hard because he assumed correctly that the training would matter more than luck when the moment came. On the afternoon of August 18th, that assumption was about to be tested in the worst possible way. D Company moved into the rubber plantation in 3 platoons, spread out to search efficiently. 11 platoon on the left, 10 platoon in the center, 12 platoon behind them in reserve. It was a formation built for finding an enemy who might run. It was not built for an enemy who intended to stand and fight in strength. When 11 Platoon made contact just after 1600 hours, the first minutes told Harry Smith almost nothing useful. Radio traffic was fragmented. The rain had grown heavier, reducing visibility inside the plantation to a few dozen meters and turning red laterite soil into a shifting, ankle-deep slick that slowed movement and made it harder to maintain a coherent line. What he could hear through the static was enough to know his lead platoon was in serious trouble. Second Lieutenant Gordon Sharp, commanding 11 Platoon, was killed early in the engagement along with several of his men, as the platoon was struck by fire from multiple directions at once. Not the pattern of a small ambush party, but of a much larger force already positioned to encircle whatever came down that track. Command of the platoon's survivors fell to Sergeant Bob Phuoc, who now had to hold a shattered position, keep wounded men alive, and somehow relay a picture of the battle back to a company commander who could not see what he was describing. This is the moment the old assumption collapsed completely. Harry Smith was not facing a rear guard. He was facing a force large enough to threaten the survival of his entire company, and he had to make that judgment in real time, with incomplete information, while his forward platoon was already fighting for its life. What he did next did not come from luck. It came from a decision structure his training had built for exactly this kind of collapse. He ordered 10 and 12 platoons to consolidate rather than push forward piecemeal into the same trap that had caught 11 Platoon. He began pulling his company into a tighter, more defensible perimeter, accepting that he could not save ground, only men. And he opened the link that would define the rest of the battle, the call for artillery. That call went to the forward observer attached to D Company, an artillery officer whose job was to translate a chaotic, half-seen battle into grid coordinates that guns miles away could fire on with confidence. The relationship between an infantry commander losing control of his own perimeter and an artillery officer calling in fire close enough to shave the edge of that perimeter would become the single most important mechanism of the entire battle. Not a weapon that simply supported the infantry, but one that effectively became the infantry's missing numbers. Bob Phuoc, meanwhile, was doing something just as essential in a smaller frame, holding 11 platoon survivors together, moving wounded men, redistributing ammunition from the dead and the dying to the men still capable of firing. It was not the kind of action that shows up cleanly in an after-action report. It was the difference between a platoon that disintegrated and one that barely held its shape long enough to fall back toward the rest of the company. By the time D Company's 3 platoons had drawn into a single defensive position, the shape of the next 3 hours was already set. They would not win this fight by maneuver. They would win it, if they won it at all, by making the ground around them impossible to cross. And that meant trusting men they could not see, working guns they could not aim themselves, to draw a wall of steel close enough to the perimeter to matter, and far enough away not to kill the men it was meant to save. Artillery support in Vietnam usually worked at a comfortable distance, close enough to hurt the enemy, far enough to guarantee the safety of the men calling it in. What happened over Long Tan broke that comfortable distance almost immediately. Guns at Nui Dat, reinforced by additional batteries brought to bear as the scale of the fight became clear, began firing in support of D Company within minutes of the first contact. But as the perimeter shrank and the enemy pressed closer through the trees, the forward observer had to make an increasingly dangerous calculation. Rounds landing far enough away to be safe were no longer landing close enough to stop the attack. The only way to keep the position from being overrun was to walk the barrage in tighter, sometimes close enough that shrapnel fell inside the company's own perimeter. This is the mechanism at the center of the entire battle. It was not simply that Australia had more guns than the Viet Cong had rifles. It was that a company which could not physically hold its ground through sheer numbers used artillery as a substitute for numbers it did not have. A wall of high explosive doing the work that another 2 or 3 platoons might otherwise have done, called in, adjusted, and recalled by a handful of men doing math under fire, in the rain, faster than the enemy could adapt to it. The proof came in the pattern of the attacks themselves. Wave after wave of Viet Cong and North Vietnamese soldiers pushed toward the Australian line, and wave after wave broke against a curtain of artillery fire that arrived faster than the attackers could regroup for another rush. It did not stop the enemy from reaching the perimeter. In places, fighting was close enough that grenades were the primary weapon, but it prevented the one thing that would have ended the battle in minutes: a coordinated breakthrough on a single weak point before D Company could reinforce it. Inside the perimeter, the company was fighting 2 battles at once. The visible one was against the soldiers in the tree line. The quieter one was against the numbers on an ammunition count that kept falling. Riflemen carried limited loads by design, enough for a patrol, not for a sustained defensive battle against a force many times their size. Machine gunners were rationing belts they had expected to last the afternoon, not 4 hours of continuous contact. Men began stripping magazines from the wounded and the dead, redistributing rounds platoon to platoon, because the alternative was a gap in the line with nothing behind it. This is where the new system proved itself for the first time, not in theory, but in results. A company with dwindling ammunition, no ability to maneuver, and no realistic path to reinforcement on foot, held its ground for over an hour past the point where a purely infantry defense should have collapsed, because the artillery kept arriving close enough and accurately enough to break each new assault before it could exploit the gaps the Australians could no longer fully cover themselves. It was not a clean solution. Danger close fire missions carry real risk to the men calling them, and every adjustment radioed back to the guns was a bet that the coordinates were right, that the rain hadn't scrambled the transmission, that the shells would land on the enemy and not on 11 platoons remaining survivors. But it worked. Each broken assault bought minutes. Minutes were the only currency that mattered, because somewhere behind them, a second decision was already being made, one that would determine whether those minutes turned into hours or ran out. By the second hour, the battle had settled into a brutal rhythm. Assault, artillery response, momentary quiet. Then another assault from a different angle, as the attacking force probed for the weak point that would let it finally break through. Each cycle cost D Company more than the last. The rain had not eased. If anything, it had gotten worse, turning the plantation into a gray wall that swallowed sound and sight past a few dozen meters. Radio operators fought static and dropped transmissions at the exact moments clarity mattered most, relaying casualty reports, ammunition counts, and fire corrections through a connection that could cut out mid-sentence. For a company whose survival now depended entirely on the accuracy of an artillery link it could not see the other end of, that kind of interference was its own quiet crisis, running underneath the louder one. Ammunition was the harder number to manage. Australian infantry loads were built for a day patrol, not a siege. As the hours wore on, sections began consolidating remaining rounds, prioritizing the weapons most critical to holding specific points on the line, particularly the machine guns, whose sustained fire was doing more to break up enemy rushes than individual rifles could. Men who ran dry took rounds from wounded comrades who no longer needed them, or waited, weapon empty, for a chance to strip ammunition from whoever fell next to them. It was not the kind of detail commanders wanted to have to report, and it was the truth of what was holding the line together as much as the artillery was. At company headquarters within the perimeter, Harry Smith was managing a battle that had stopped being about tactics in any conventional sense. There was no maneuver left to attempt, no flank to exploit, no ground to trade for time. There was only the perimeter, the guns, and the question of whether both would hold long enough for something else to change the equation. He had already requested reinforcement and resupply, the two things that could turn a defensive stand into a survivable one. Now it was a matter of whether either could physically reach a position that was, by every account reaching task force headquarters, still under heavy and sustained attack. At Nui Dat, the scale of what D Company had walked into was no longer in doubt. Radio reports, however fragmented, made clear this was not a company-sized fight. It was regimental. That reality forced a decision that could not wait for better information, whether to commit additional forces into a battle whose exact boundaries and intensity were still impossible to see clearly from several kilometers away, in weather that grounded or complicated air support and made overland movement slow and exposed. It was, in its own way, a mirror of the mistake that had started the day, a decision made with incomplete information under pressure, where waiting for certainty was itself a risk. But this time, the stakes of getting it wrong ran in both directions. Send help too cautiously, and D Company might not survive to be reinforced. Send it too aggressively, without adequate preparation, and a relief force could walk into the same ambush conditions that had nearly destroyed the company it was trying to save. Back inside the perimeter, none of that calculation was visible to the men holding the line. What was visible was a diminishing ammunition count, a company that had not broken but had not been reinforced, and the fading light of a Vietnamese afternoon moving toward dusk. A deadline nobody had set on paper, but every soldier in that plantation understood instinctively. Whatever was coming to help them needed to arrive before dark turned an already desperate defense into an impossible one. Two decisions, made almost simultaneously, and neither of them safe, would decide whether D Company walked out of that plantation or was overrun in it. The first was an ammunition resupply by air, with rounds running critically low across the perimeter and no ground route available in time. Helicopters were tasked to fly directly over the position and drop ammunition to the men below. A mission that meant flying low and slow through weather bad enough to ground routine operations into airspace directly over an active firefight, with no guarantee the crews could even see the perimeter clearly enough to hit it. It was not a maneuver anyone would choose under normal circumstances. It was the only option left. The helicopters came in low through the rain, delivered their loads over the company position, and pulled away. And for the men on the ground, watching crates of ammunition fall out of a gray sky into a battle they had genuinely believed they might lose from lack of bullets alone. It was the first hard evidence that they were not being left to fight this alone. The second decision was harder and slower and far more dangerous to execute: send armor. A relief force built around M113 armored personnel carriers, together with an additional rifle company, was ordered to move toward D Company's position, not along a prepared route, but across open and wooded ground, in the same rain and failing light that had turned the plantation into a maze for everyone already inside it. Armored vehicles moving without full reconnaissance of what lay ahead of them, racing a clock that had nothing to do with tactics and everything to do with the setting sun, carried their own very real risk of ambush. Whoever gave the order to send them was accepting that risk deliberately, because the alternative, waiting for a safer, slower, more thoroughly prepared advance, meant D Company might not still be a fighting force by the time that advance arrived. The carriers pushed forward through terrain that fought them as much as the enemy did, engines straining in mud, visibility reduced to almost nothing, guided as much by radio contact with the encircled company as by the ground in front of them. For the defenders inside the perimeter, still holding a line built on dwindling ammunition and artillery fire, walked in dangerously close. The sound of approaching engines was not yet relief. It was a possibility, arriving out of a gray tree line that had, for hours, only produced enemy fire. When the M113s finally broke into the plantation and opened fire on the attacking force from an unexpected direction, the effect was immediate and decisive. An enemy that had spent nearly 4 hours pressing an encircled company, absorbing artillery fire, and still finding the will to keep attacking, now faced armored vehicles arriving from ground they had not prepared to defend against. The psychological weight of that arrival mattered as much as its firepower. A battle that had been a grinding static defense for hours became, in a matter of minutes, an engagement the attacking force could no longer sustain. As dusk settled fully over the plantation, the volume of incoming fire against D Company's perimeter began, for the first time since 1600 hours, to fall rather than build. The regiment that had come to destroy 108 Australians was withdrawing, not because it had been annihilated, but because the cost of continuing had become higher than whatever objective had justified the attack in the first place. The company that airstrikes, artillery, an airborne resupply, and an armored relief force had together kept alive through the worst of the afternoon, would spend that night and much of the next day still inside the plantation, but it would spend it as the side that had held the ground, not the side that had been swept from it. The plantation on the morning of August 19th looked like a different place than it had 24 hours earlier, and what it revealed was the full price of the 4 hours that had just ended. 18 Australians did not survive Long Tan, 17 killed during the battle itself, and one more who died of his wounds days later. 24 to 25 others were wounded out of a company that had gone out that afternoon with roughly 108 men. That is not a statistic to pass over quickly. It means more than a third of D Company's fighting strength became a casualty in under 4 hours, the highest toll Australia would suffer in any single engagement of the entire war. Among the dead was 2nd Lieutenant Gordon Sharp, killed in the opening minutes of contact, before most of the company even understood the scale of what it had walked into. His platoon, taken over under fire by Sergeant Bob Phuoc, absorbed some of the heaviest losses of the battle, a reminder that the men who bore the worst of Long Tan were often the ones caught furthest forward, with the least warning and the least time to react. Searching the ground the following morning, Australian soldiers found the physical evidence of what the artillery and the final armored assault had done. 245 enemy dead were counted directly on the battlefield, along with abandoned weapons, equipment, and clear signs, blood trails, drag marks, that additional casualties had been carried away during the withdrawal. Estimates of total enemy wounded vary widely, with figures ranging anywhere from roughly 200 to 800, a gap that reflects how difficult it was to assess losses for a force that had pulled its casualties out under cover of darkness and rain. It is worth being honest about a harder fact here. The numbers on the other side of this battle are not settled, and they never fully were. Australian sources describe a force in the range of 1,500 to 2,500 men, with something closer to 1,500 to 2,000 directly engaged in the assault on D Company. Accounts drawing on Vietnamese sources, by contrast, describe a considerably smaller engaged force and report far fewer losses among their own troops than the Australian battlefield count suggests. Both sides had reasons, operational, political, and reputational, to describe the scale of the fight in the terms that served them best. The clearest, most consistently documented facts are Australia's own losses, precisely recorded, and the number of enemy dead physically counted on the ground the morning after. Everything beyond that carries a wider margin of uncertainty than a simple headline figure suggests. What is not in dispute is what the battle cost the Australians who lived through it, whether they were wounded that day or walked away physically untouched. Long Tan was, by any measure, a company thrown into a fight several sizes larger than anything its patrol orders had anticipated, and asked to hold a defensive position against odds that, in a straight infantry contest, it had no realistic way of winning. That it held it all, bleeding men, running low on ammunition, dependent from the first hour on artillery fire close enough to be dangerous to itself, is the part of the story that casualty figures alone cannot fully capture. The mud, the rubber trees, and the names on 18 headstones are what the victory actually cost, and no accounting of enemy losses changes that ledger for the families who received the news from Phuoc province in the last weeks of August 1966. It is tempting to remember Long Tan as a simple story. 108 Australians against thousands, and they won because they were braver. It is a satisfying version of events, and it is not wrong to honor the courage it took to hold that perimeter for 4 hours in the rain. But it is an incomplete explanation, and Long Tan deserves the complete one. 4 factors, working together, explain what happened in that plantation, and removing any one of them changes the outcome. The first is artillery, called in close enough to the Australian perimeter to be genuinely dangerous to the men it was protecting, without a forward observer translating a chaotic, half-seen battle into coordinates that guns miles away could trust, and without those guns firing accurately and continuously for hours. D Company's ammunition alone would not have stopped the volume of attacks it faced. The second is command decision-making under incomplete information on both ends of the battle. Harry Smith's choice to consolidate rather than maneuver, made in the confused first minutes of contact, kept the company from being defeated in pieces the way 11 Platoon nearly was, and the decision at task force level to commit an armored relief force before the situation was fully confirmed, accepting the real risk of sending vehicles into unreconnoitered ground, was the second piece of judgment under pressure that the battle required. The third is the airborne ammunition resupply, a mission flown in weather and under fire that would have justified refusing it, executed anyway because the alternative was a company that ran dry before help could arrive. And the fourth is timing itself. Every other factor mattered only because it arrived before dark. A relief force that reached the plantation an hour later, an ammunition drop delayed by weather, an artillery barrage that came in too cautious to matter. Any one of those failures on its own could have turned Long Tan from Australia's most costly battle into something far worse. This is also where the tempting oversimplification needs correcting from the other direction. It is equally easy, looking only at the artillery and the armor, to frame this as a story about technology and firepower overwhelming a poorly equipped enemy. The evidence does not support that either. The force D Company fought was organized, disciplined, and willing to keep attacking into sustained artillery fire for hours, the mark of trained soldiers executing a deliberate operation, not an improvised raid. Long Tan was not won because the enemy was weak. It was won because a small, exposed Australian company and the artillery, aircraft, and armored units supporting it performed under worse conditions than any of them had trained for, close to, as well as their doctrine asked of them, and because that was, by a narrow margin, enough. In the years that followed, Long Tan's legacy took 2 distinct forms. Publicly, it became the defining battle of Australia's Vietnam War. The reason the 18th of August is observed each year as Vietnam Veterans Day, and the reason the plantation itself, and the cross later erected there, became a place of pilgrimage for the soldiers who survived it and the families of those who did not. Privately, within the ranks of the men who fought it, Long Tan also became a decades-long argument about recognition, a conviction held for years by Harry Smith and others that the scale of what D Company had survived was never matched by the honors it initially received. That argument would not be fully resolved for a very long time, and it remains part of how the battle is remembered by the men closest to it. What Long Tan actually proved was narrower and more useful than the myth of impossible odds overcome by courage alone. It proved that a small, isolated force, cut off in bad terrain and worse weather, can survive contact with a much larger enemy, not through numbers it did not have, but through a system, artillery close enough to be dangerous, decisions made fast enough to matter, and resupply and relief pushed forward before the last reasonable moment to send them had passed. Take away any one piece of that system, and the story told today would not be about a battle Australia held. It would be about one it lost.